Hi, welcome back to our lecture. In this hands-on segment, we are going to work with the AWS Codedeploy service. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy a CloudFormation stack, which I have listed in the presentation. So I'll go ahead and copy this S3 bucket link to the stack. And I have already logged into the console and I'm looking at the CloudFormation dashboard. I will create a new stack using the existing template and click on Next. It's going to ask me for a stack name. I will just call this the website stack. I will specify a key, my current IP address, which is already copied here. And so I will paste that. The CEDAR address. And the rest of the parameters I will leave at their defaults and click on Next. Okay, and then all of these I'll just leave at their defaults. All these other settings, click Next. I'll click on I will acknowledge that we might create some IAM resources. I'll go ahead and create the stack. And so this is going to take a little while to create, and so I'll probably pause the video here. But while this is starting to create, let me explain what it is doing. We are launching a stack which will create a VPC with a couple public subnets. The subnets will host a web server instance, so there'll be two web server instances as part of an auto scaling group. And then the stack is also launching an application load balancer, which will distribute requests to the two EC2 instances, which are part of that auto scaling group. So a very, very simple stack that we're launching here. And these web server instances have Nginx installed on them, and it's just sort of a basic default Nginx installation. And when the stack completes, then we'll take a quick look at some of the resources that were built. But for now, I'm just going to pause the video while the stack creates. Hi, welcome back. The website stack is now completed and all of the resources have been created. Let's take a look at a couple of these resources. First, we have if I click on the outputs link for the stack, you'll see that there is an elastic load balancer with an endpoint which has been created. Let me just copy that endpoint and go to it in a browser so you can see that the web servers are responding. And they're just responding with the basic welcome to Nginx website. So there's really no website or application code which has been deployed yet to the web servers. And we're going to use the Codedeploy service to deploy a very simple website to these web servers. If I go back to the stack outputs, you also see that there is an S3 bucket, an artifact bucket, which has been created. And we're going to use this artifact bucket during the code deployment process. Essentially, we are going to take an output artifact from a build, which in our case is a zip file called website.zip. And that contains a very basic website. We're going to deploy that output artifact into the artifact bucket, this S3 bucket. And then the Codedeploy service will pick up this artifact and deploy it to each of the web servers in the environment which was created. So I'm going to go to this S3 bucket. If I go to the S3 console, here's my bucket, which has been created. There's nothing in the bucket yet. And so I will go ahead and upload a file to it. I'm going to upload the website.zip file, and I've included a link to this file in the lecture presentation. I'm going to upload this file, but when I upload it, there's one thing I need to make sure I do, and that is I need to make sure that the file is encrypted, because I set up an S3. I set up an access policy for that bucket requiring that all files stored in that bucket are stored encrypted. So I will specify encryption, and I'm going to encrypt it using the default AWS S3 KMS master key. And click on Next and click Upload. And there's my website.zip file. That's been uploaded to the artifact bucket. Now, as you will see a little bit later in the lecture, when we do when we look at the AWS Code Pipeline service, you'll see how these things kind of fit together. Normally, you'd have a code build process which would build the website.zip artifact, and it would place it then, it would upload it into this artifact bucket. And then the code deploy service would deploy that artifact. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So right now we're sort of simulating the process of uploading that output artifact into this artifact bucket. Okay, so I have the artifact in the bucket. The next thing, one other thing I'll just show you is if I go to the EC2 dashboard, here are the two web server instances which are running. They're part of an auto scaling group, and the load balancer is associated with that auto scaling group and distributing requests to the web servers. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do then is I will open up a new tab, and I'm going to go to the code deploy service. So I type in code deploy, and I want to create in code deploy, I want to create a new application. I will create an application. I'm going to call it just website for the application name is fine. I need to specify a compute platform. What kind of application environment do I want to deploy the output artifact to? And we're going to be deploying to EC2 instances. I'll go ahead and create the application. And so now I have an application. The next thing I need to do is I need to create a deployment group for this application environment. I'll click on the Create Deployment Group button. And what the deployment group is really doing is it's specifying the exact specific EC2 instances that I want to deploy to. I'm going to give my deployment group a name, and I'll just say website group. I need to specify a service role, and I'm going to just use this default code deployer role, which is in my account. And I want to do an in-place deployment. Environment configuration. So we need to essentially specify the EC2 instances that we want to deploy to. We could do that a couple different ways. We could specify the exact EC2 instances, or we could specify the auto scaling group that the instances are associated with. And that's what I'm going to do here, because I created an auto scaling group. You notice that this is matching two unique instances. And that tells me that it was able to associate those two instances with the auto scaling group and with this deployment group. I'm going to scroll down. How do we want to deploy our application? We could deploy everything at once, so use the all at once deployment. That's like a big bang deployment. I generally don't want to do that. I want to deploy one at a time. There are only two instances, so it shouldn't take very long. And the nice thing about one at a time is that if I had any customers who were accessing my website, they wouldn't see any downtime. They wouldn't see any sort of disruption, because I'm only updating one web server at a time. We can use a load balancer to manage the incoming traffic, and I'll kind of show you what that means here in a little bit. But so we're going to use the load balancer to manage the incoming traffic. We're going to choose the target group that the load balancer is associated with. And everything else, we don't need to change any of these other settings, but I'll just kind of scroll through them. So those are all fine. We'll next create the deployment group. So now we have specified the application, we've specified the deployment group, which is essentially sort of scoping the application deployment to a specific set of EC2 instances, and those are the instances which are associated with the auto scaling group. And the final thing that I need to do is I need to create an actual deployment. And when we create a deployment, what we're basically doing is we are specifying the actual artifact, the actual code package that we want to deploy into the deployment group. So I'll go ahead and click on the Create Deployment button. And we have our deployment group. It's an EC2 platform. And our application is stored in S3. And remember, we stored it in this S3 bucket here. And one thing to be careful of is that when you specify the S3 location, it wants you to use an S3 URL. And I can't just copy and paste this in here, because this is actually a web URL. So I need to remove the domain name portion of it and just use the bucket name. And then the output artifact that I want to deploy is website.zip. That's the file that I want to deploy. And let's see. Here I'm just going to leave all these defaults the way they are. And then finally, I will create a deployment. So I'll click on the Create Deployment button, and the actual deployment process will begin. You can see it says in progress. Now, this deployment is going to take about 15 minutes or so, and I will pause the video here shortly, because we don't need to sit and watch this deployment take 15 minutes. But if I scroll down, you'll see that there are some lifecycle events occurring. And I want you to pay attention to those lifecycle events over the next 15 minutes. The first thing that it's doing is that it shows both instances, and it will update and deploy that website.zip package on both instances. When it deploys that package, it's actually going to unzip the contents of the package into the website root directory on each web server. What it's doing initially, however, is it's communicating with the load balancer, and it's telling the load balancer to block incoming requests to this particular instance. So the load balancer will essentially quiesce any sort of ingress requests to the web server first, and it'll do that for about 5 minutes or so, just to make sure there are no long lingering requests running on that web server. Then it will basically, I think, shut down the actual web service that's running on the web server. It will deploy the new code, and then it will restart the web service, and then it will notify the load balancer that the server is now available, and it will begin to distribute requests to that instance again. Then the next thing it will do is it will start blocking traffic to the second instance and go through the same process. So I will pause the video here and just watch these lifecycle events over the next 15 minutes to see the progress of this deployment. Okay, welcome back to our video. The deployment has now succeeded. You can see that it says 2 of 2 instances which have been updated. And if you look at the lifecycle events, then you can see it was successful in updating each of the 2 EC2 instances. If I click on View Events, then it will actually show all of the individual events. You can see that these are all lifecycle events. It was blocking traffic, and then after it blocked the traffic, it stopped the application, downloaded the bundle, which was our website.zip file. It installed the application, it started it back up, and then it told the application load balancer to begin distributing traffic to the updated web server again. If I go to my application load balancer endpoint address, and if I click on refresh, now you see that my website has been updated. I know this isn't the most exciting web page, but the point here is that it shows you that it was able to successfully deploy the application bundle, that output artifact, to each of these web servers. Now, all of these different things this entire process could have been managed using CloudFormation. And in the template, I provide a CloudFormation script that you can take a look at, to see how you would actually build all of this using the Codedeploy resource within CloudFormation. And I'm going to pause the template and pull up that template file so we can take a look at it. I have pulled up the Codedeploy CloudFormation template, and I just want to run through it real quickly. We have all of our input parameters here that you saw earlier, and we have an artifact bucket, an S3 bucket, which we are creating. That bucket has a bucket policy, and this bucket policy is just essentially saying that you must upload objects and store them encrypted within the S3 bucket. The stack creates a VPC, and that VPC has 2 public subnets. We have a security group here for our application load balancer, which is allowing incoming HTTP port 80 traffic from anywhere on the internet. We also have a web server security group, which is going to allow incoming traffic from the load balancer, port 80 traffic, also shell traffic, port 22 traffic from your IP address. We have an internet gateway, and that gateway is being attached to the VPC. We have a public routing table, and that routing table has a default route, which is routing all traffic out through the internet gateway. And we have the public route associations with these subnets. An elastic load balancer here, and the elastic load balancer is set up to access both of our public subnets. It's an internet-facing load balancer. The listener on the load balancer is going to forward requests to a target group, which is also defined and referenced here in the template. It's going to forward requests over port 80. And then our target group. We have a health check defined in our target group. Our health check path is just simply the root directory on each EC2 instance. We have an auto scaling group, which is referencing a launch configuration, which is also created within the template. The minimum size and max size is specified using an input parameter, which defaults to 2. And we also have an IAM instance profile, which is associated with each of the 2 instances. And this actually is an important profile. This is an important instance role, which I'll point out here in a minute. We have our web launch configuration. This is defining this is the template essentially for our EC2 instances. You see that we have image and instance type. These are input parameters. We have the key, referencing our security group. And then there's some user data. There's a user data script which is run, and this user data script will install Ruby, and it will install Nginx, startup Nginx. And one of the important pieces here is that we'll actually install an agent, a code deploy agent, and I think it's a Ruby script, hence the need to install Ruby on the system. And this code deploy script is what the code deploy service uses to actually deploy our application bundle on the web server. You can see that we start up this code deploy agent service to run on this server. And then here's the instance role, which I mentioned. And the key part of this instance role is this managed policy. The EC2 instance needs to have access to, it needs to have the AWS Codedeploy full access capability. And that is essentially what allows the EC2 instance to communicate with the Codedeploy service. And it also has access to the artifact bucket, which is created in this template. It has the ability to get objects from that artifact bucket. And that's important because the Codedeploy agent, which is running on the EC2 instance, it needs to be able to communicate and get commands from the Codedeploy service, and it needs to be able to connect to the S3 bucket to download the artifact, the application package, which is stored there. And here's the actual Codedeploy resources that are set up. We have an application resource. This is defining our Codedeploy application. The compute platform, it's a server. So it's an EC2 instance. And then we also have the deployment group. The deployment group is referencing the application that we created in the template. It's also referencing the auto scaling group that we created. We have the deployment config name, which is the one at a time process. So we're updating just one EC2 instance at a time. The deployment style is to do an in-place deployment using traffic control. And for traffic control, it's going to communicate with the load balancer. So we specify the target group with that's associated with that load balancer, and the deployment process will control the load balancer, and it's it will selectively then block access to instances which are being updated. And then finally, there is a service role which the deployment group will use to deploy services, deploy the code. And here's the service role which is set up, and it uses this managed policy, which is the AWS Codedeploy role. And then the template ends with a couple outputs. We have the Elastic load balancing endpoint address, and we have the S3 artifact bucket, which is also created by the template. So the only thing that this template isn't creating is the actual deployment. If you recall, I went in and manually created and triggered a deployment where I specified the exact output artifact and where it was located, and specified that I wanted to deploy that output artifact to this particular deployment group. And in the next hands-on segment, you will see how we kind of can integrate these different services together, like code build and code deploy, using the code pipeline service to create sort of one single pipeline of different events and tasks. I hope you enjoyed this hands-on segment and you feel more comfortable working with the code deploy service.